Muslims understood, look, we have the truth in Islam, but that doesn't mean we're the best chemists. That doesn't mean we're the best physicists. That doesn't mean we're the best architects. So they took all of this knowledge, and as you all know, the story, this portion of the story is all known to you, they reached the pinnacle of civilization. At the turn of the millennia, 1000 CE or so, at the turn of the millennia, people from Europe would be coming to Andalus to study medicine, to study architecture. Just like many of us and our parents came here to study medicine and architecture and engineering. Once upon a time, people from Europe would come to Andalus to study these sciences and then take them back to their lands. The first major encounter between Islam and Christianity was the Crusades. And in 1096, as you know, the Crusaders came out of Germany and France and the Netherlands, and they made their way to Palestine, and they conquered Jerusalem. Now, in this interaction, for the first time, paper began to be introduced to Europe. For the first time, they're acquiring this material, and they are amazed, they're mesmerized. What an amazing thing to write on. But they don't know how to make paper, because this is an Islamic art. This is an Islamic science. Muslims have acquired it. Eventually, as Christianity began to conquer portions of Andalusia, in the famous Reconquista, you know, they began to conquer portions of Spain. Eventually, they acquired the very paper manufacturing mills from the Muslims. And therefore, it is no coincidence, it is no surprise, that the very first paper manufacturing mill in Christendom was in a city that is called Yativa, which is close to Murcia, which is in Andalusia. The very first paper manufacturing mill in all of Europe, owned by Christians, was in reconquered Andalusia. Basically, they took over a Muslim paper manufacturer and they began conquering it. Now that it was in the hands of the Christians, they began selling paper to other Christian ports. And so, within 100 years or so, it reached Italy, it reached Germany, it reached France. And, of course, why Italy? Why Italy? Because there were direct trading routes from Spain to Italy. Ships would sail from Spain to Italy. And with the advent of paper, of course, people need paper, and so the Italians learned the art, and so Italy began to set up paper mills in its lands, and then, this is in 1276, in 1320, the first paper mills open up in Germany. Also around this time, Arabs are still trading in the world. They go to India, and Arab traders introduce paper to India, and that spreads all over India. So, around 12 or 1300, the best paper produced is in Islamic lands. Europe is still producing, it's just learning how to produce. Now, with this coming of paper in the 13th century, all of a sudden, this is also coinciding with the Renaissance, right? The 1300s is when the Renaissance began. And that is not a coincidence. It's not a coincidence that the Renaissance occurs around the turn of the 13th century, 1200, 1300. Why? Because this is the time when Muslims and Europeans are interacting. This is the time when conquered lands of Andalusia, have given their libraries, their arts, their sciences, have given Aristotle and Plato and Socrates, which the West always had banned, has given all of this to them. So they begin to discover these books, they discover paper, and slowly but surely Europe struggles to come out of the Dark Ages. And the Renaissance begins, even though the Catholic Church in the beginning banned paper, the Catholic Church banned books, but of course it was a losing battle. You all know. So the Renaissance slowly but surely became stronger and stronger, even though the Roman Catholic Church tried its best to halt all of this flowing. Now the Europeans, like every civilization, just like the Muslims, we're not any different, they take the best, they use their minds, and they make it better. So they took the paper manufacturing mills from the Muslims, and they developed on it. And they did things that the Muslims did not do. Of the most important elements that they added was to use water mills to churn the machines that make the paper. So they used streams of the rivers, they used the currents to churn those water wheels in order to mesh the paper, and therefore the quality, because you have stronger machines, and the quantity, because this is water and it's not a human being, of paper began to increase. So Europe begins to slowly but surely get better and better at making paper than Muslims were. And this is around 1300 or so. So to illustrate the point, around 900, 1000, 1100 CE, the only mass producers of paper in the whole world were Muslim lands. Chinese themselves have forgotten about it, meaning it's always an art for them. It was a luxury item. The only people producing paper are Muslims. By the 12th century, the competition begins. And by the 15th century, paper is being exported from Europe into Muslim lands. We see now, it's not just, I'm giving an example, but the tide is changing. We were at the top, and then we start to peter out, and then the decline begins, right? So and this is an example, that's only one example, with the example of paper. So by 1500 or so, we have, right now, thousands of manuscripts around the world, written in 15, 16, 17. I've seen some of these at Yale. I've seen some of these. The paper, we had a whole class about examining manuscripts. The paper that this book of fiqh is written on, we look up into it and we see the watermark and it says, in Italian, made in Florence and so and so, right? It's a book of Hanbali fiqh being written in Islamic lands. But the paper that they're writing it on, which is the best paper in the world at the time, is being imported from Florence, Italy, right? So we see now the tide is changing. We see now that in this one aspect where the Muslims had taken it, developed it, ruled the world, slowly but surely things are changing. Now, with all of this paper, European thinkers now need to think how to utilize it, right? Whenever there's a commodity that's cheap, that's present, well, people start utilizing it. And therefore, not a coincidence, what happens in Europe? What happens in Germany where paper mills have been invented in 1320? What happens by 1420? Who can tell me? Nobody? Anybody?
Press. Printing press.
Gutenberg does what? Invents
Printing press.
the printing press, right? And the printing press is one of the most important discoveries or inventions of all of humanity in its entire history. I mean, it is true to say that this ranks along with the wheel and sliced bread or something like this, you know what I'm saying, right? The printing press is one of the most significant discoveries in all of humanity or inventions. Because for the first time, you can mass produce. You don't have to sit down and write a book. Can you imagine if there were no printing press, right? How would you acquire a book? You would have to sit down and write it cover to cover. And there are errors, and there are problems, and there's this and that. It's crazy. So Gutenberg comes along, there's a lot of paper, and by the way, how many of you knew this? His business partner in inventing the press was a paper mill manufacturer. Because you got a lot of paper, right? And so his business partner was a paper manufacturer. And so the two of them together invent this printing press. And now, with this new technology, the face of Europe begins to change. The Renaissance is given a new push, and then along comes the Reformation. And the Reformation shook the Catholic Church straight to its core. It divided Christendom into two large halves that we're still dealing with today, Catholicism and Protestantism. Without the printing press, there could be no Reformation, there could be no Renaissance. It is estimated that by the year 1500, over 20 million books had sold in a civilization that 100 years ago barely knew how to read and write. What's going to happen to the psyche? What's going to happen to the mind frame of a civilization that is now reading, that's absorbing, that's buying books? What's going to happen? Well, obviously, they're going to rise. They're going to become stronger. They're going to become more educated. And that's exactly what happened. By the time Columbus came to America, there were already printing presses all over Europe. And therefore, within 20 years, he and his people brought printing presses here to the Americas. In Mexico City, there was a printing press in 1510 or so. Already there's a printing press running in 1510 or so. Therefore, printing presses changed the face of Europe. Of course, many other things as well, but we're talking about one example for this class. Now, what's happening in Muslim lands? Well, one would have imagined that just like paper, just like all of these technologies, when the printing press is introduced to the Muslims, they're going to jump at it, take it, invent it, renovate it, do something this and that, change the whole psyche. Here is where the turn begins. When the printing press was introduced to Muslim lands, the scholars rejected it. Haram. We cannot use printing presses. Why? Because this is an invention of the Christian kafirs. Well, I'm not joking. They called it a kafir invention. Right? They had no problems getting a lot of the other stuff from Christian kafirs. But they didn't want to get, for some reason, the printing press. And so they shut their minds to the printing press. And they said, no, we're not going to get the printing press. Because, for some reason, they had the reasons for that. In 1515, the Ottoman Emperor Sultan Bayezid II decreed that anybody who printed books in Arabic, listen to this, anybody who is caught with printed books shall be executed. It was a crime punishable by death in Muslim lands to own and operate, or even to own a book that had been printed in Arabic. Why? Because it was blasphemous. This is ridda. This is kufr to have a printed book. I'm not joking with you. Look this up. I know this is shocking to many of you, but this is the emperor of the sultan himself, the fatwa or the qarar of the sultan himself. 1515, Sultan Bayezid II. It is illegal under penalty of death to operate or own a printing press. And printing remained banned in Muslim lands for over 300 years. 300 years. You understand how long was 300 years? America did not exist 300 years ago. That's how long 300 years is, right? America is celebrating its, 250, whatever, something, right? So America is not even 300 years old. For more than 300 years, the scholars of Islamic lands had shut their minds and said, no, we're not going to import this. Why was this? And by the way, because of this ban, the first books ever printed in Arabic, the first Qur'ans printed by the printing press, were done by non-Muslims, obviously, because it's haram to own a printing press. It's kufr to print books on a printing press. So what happens? The first Qur'ans ever printed were printed in Venice, in Habsburg, in Germany, in lands, Russia. There weren't any printed Qur'ans or books at all in Islamic lands. And in 1521, a group of people living in the Ottoman lands managed to obtain a permit that allowed them to print books in their native language. This group of people were the Jews. So the only printing press that was operating in all of the Ottoman lands were the Yahud. And they were allowed to print in their language. And so obviously they became even more educated, and they became civil servants and bureaucrats, because look, in the end of the day, a government needs efficient bureaucrats. It needs educated people, right? And therefore, minorities in Ottoman lands usually had the best jobs. And it's not a conspiracy, it's just a fact. If you're better educated, you know how to do the math, you know how to run a business, you know how to show then you're going to get promotions. And so the minorities, Christian and Jewish minorities, were typically better educated. Most of the doctors were Christians. Most of the bureaucrats and translators were Jews because they were more educated. It was just a part of the landscape. And of course, amongst the Muslim circles, it was completely impermissible, as we said, to have a printing press. And the very first printing press that operated in Arab lands was actually imported by Napoleon Bonaparte when he invaded Egypt in 1798. Napoleon invaded Egypt. A lot of people try to understand, or they try to rationalize, they try to understand, why would he do such a thing? I think this is a mistake. You never rationalize Napoleon. Napoleon is somebody who just accepts what he did without thinking why he did it. He invaded Egypt, that's just a fact. Why he did it, we're never going to know. It seems completely ridiculous. But this was the beginnings of colonialism. The first time that non-Muslim powers literally just came in, took over, and to the victor belongs the spoils. So when Napoleon came, Napoleon brought a printing press with him. And therefore, the first printing press to operate under non-Muslim rule in Arab lands was from Napoleon. But the prohibition remained for another 35 years until finally, around 1825 or so, the Ottomans finally had to collapse. And they allowed, listen to this, the printing of non-Arabic books on subjects that had nothing to do with the religion, number 2. Number 3, from a pre-approved list that the government has to check. 3 conditions. You cannot print anything in Arabic. Even if it's in Turkish, it has to be about astronomy, not about the Quran. You cannot print religious education. And it has to be from a pre-approved government list. The government has to monitor everything that is being printed. And therefore, The first printing presses to really begin to function in Islamic lands, 1840, 1850, 1860, finally run